This is the history that refuses to stay buried. The village sleeps inside its palisade, roofs of straw breathing softly in the night, a low wind combing through the thatch like a quiet hand. Beyond the ditch, under a moon rubbed thin as old silver, men crouch in a thicket of hawthorn with buckets that smell of pitch and tallow. Their breath pearls in clouds. Their palms are sticky with resin. In a crude torchlight halo, a soldier holds a sack that squirms and whimpers. He looks away as another dips a rag in the thick oily mix and fastens it to a small harness. The men do not speak. They do not want to hear the sound the creature makes when the flame takes. The captain lifts a finger. The rag is touched by fire, a streak of gold in the dark. The sack opens. A cat bolts like a shot of ink, tail a comet, claws skittering on packed earth. It vanishes through a gap in the palisade, heading, as all cats do, toward home, toward the smell of kitchens and warm ashes. The men wait. They listen. They count. On the far side of the wall, there's the faintest crackle, then another, then the sudden cough of flame finding dry reed, a shout, a bell, a child's cry. By the time the watchman reaches the ladder, an orange flower is opening across the roofline. The men in the thicket rise, pull back their bowstrings, and smile with tight mouths. Fire, they know, is the best ally a poor army can afford, and terror travels faster than ladders ever will. If you want to help me translate more stories like this, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. War in the Middle Ages was a long patience game, and fire was its impatient answer. Stones could batter, towers could creep forward on wheels, sappers could claw tunnels through damp earth, but a city with thatched roofs is tinder asking for a spark. Tactics born of desperation often look like cruelty wearing a soldier's glove. What do you do when the town before you has bread, water, hope, and you have only rope, pitch, and fear? You improvise. You remember how animals move when they are frightened, how they run for known corners, how they cling to home as if it were a lifeline. You watch the rooks circle above the market roofs at dusk. You see the alley cat stalk the refuse heap by the butcher's gate. You take that knowledge and twist it until it screams because the wall is high and time is short and your paymaster grows restless. And then, one night, the wind shifts in your favor, and men become arsonists by proxy, while pretending they do not hear the shrieks. There is a soldier whose name is lost to time who once held such a cat. He was 19, from a village where the fields were thin and the taxes thick. The captain told him it was only a tactic. A trick no worse than rolling a flaming barrel at a gate. He nodded because to nod was to eat. He dipped the rag in the bucket and told himself the cat would run away safely, that the fire would fail, that nothing, no one, would be hurt. He told himself lies because soldiers are trained to carry heavy things, and guilt is the heaviest. Years later, he would still wake to the smell of singed fur at harvest time, when the villagers burned stubble and the smoke crawled the same way across the ground. He would not speak of it to his children. He would never keep a cat. We can pretend such tactics were rare, but desperation breeds repetition. Across the continent, the logic of living fire found eager students. In a fortress town where the homes are packed shoulder to shoulder, every roof touches its neighbor like kindling laid in a careful hand. When a spark lands there, when wind draws a line of flame along a ridgepole, a city becomes a single engine of heat and panic. Water in buckets cannot keep pace, hands blister and slip. The garrison runs to the fire lines and leaves the gate momentarily thin, just thin enough for a bold company to rush the postern, just thin enough for a ladder to mount unnoticed in the glare. What begins as a cat in the dark ends as a banner on the wall at dawn, and the victors insist it was the work of steel, not fur. They prefer not to remember the first cry. Not all living fire used the same paw prints. Birds, pigeons especially, were notorious for their homing instincts, their winged love of the eaves they knew. More than one besieging commander tied a slow, smoldering twist of tow to a bird's leg and launched it skyward at dusk. The creature wheeled once, twice, then streaked toward the familiar warmth of a dovecote nestled in a thatched loft. A glow, a feathered panic, a sudden, terrible hush before the first roof went up. If you know anything of towns built in timber and reed, you know the sound of kindling catching. A small, decisive sound, like a match meeting paper. Multiply it by 20 streets, and you have the sound of a city changing sides against its will. To understand how such ideas took root, we must look at the world that cultivated them. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of fiefs and free cities, bishoprics and barons' keeps, stitched together by river lanes and muddy tracks. Wealth pooled in towns, granaries, guild halls, warehouses stacked with wool and wine. Those caches drew both trade and trouble. Siegecraft was the language of politics, the grammar of ambition. Owning walls meant owning time. Starving an enemy meant owning his future. But sieges were long, expensive, and uncertain. Any contrivance that shortened them, any device that turned a month into a night, tempted commanders whose purse strings were pulled by impatient princes. Fire, elemental and cheap, seemed an answer cut from the cloth of the earth itself. We can trace the thread farther back because war is a storyteller that repeats itself with different masks. Long before the word medieval was minted, armies learned that animals can be weapons. There are old tales of pigs smeared with pitch and set ablaze. Their panicked squealing turned into a tool to frighten war elephants. An ancient terror weapon using one creature's scream to unravel another's nerve. There are legends of a conqueror advancing under a shield of cats at a desert battle, gambling on the enemy's reverence for sacred animals to paralyze their courage. Whether every episode happened just so is less important than what they reveal. People are endlessly inventive, and when pressed, they will turn the innocent into instruments. By the time Europe built its cathedrals, the lesson had already been taught. Terror moves cheaply on 4 legs or on wings. Now imagine the siege of a border town. On one side, a mercenary company under a pennon slashed with a stag. They have crossed 2 rivers and 3 unpaid months to be here. On the other, a burgher militia guarding sausages and salt in a cold, crowded storehouse. It has rained for a week. The ground oozes. Tempers are thin as old belts. A master of engines has built a trebuchet that he swears will knock the gatehouse loose. But the ropes swell, the sling slips, the stones land like dull prayers in the mud. The captain calls his lieutenants. They whisper under a dripping awning while rain plucks the canvas like fingers on a lute string. He asks for workarounds, compromises, shortcuts. Someone speaks a phrase like a bad taste. Fire cats. There is a pause. The captain's face does not change. He nods tightly. Orders are issued. Boys are told to comb the alleys outside the walls for strays. A tinker is paid to fashion little harnesses from scrap leather. The men do not talk about it loudly. They say the word as though it might bite. When the rain ends and the wind turns dry, they will try it. Until then, they wait, and no one meets the stable boy's eyes. In another town 100 leagues away, a widow wakes to a smell her bones recognize. She sits up, heart thudding. Smoke. She pads across the floor and her bare feet find the grit of ash. The cat that sleeps among the pots is not there. Outside, the lane is a funnel of sparks. She beats at the embers and the eaves with a wet blanket until her arms tremble, and above her the sky is painted the color of vengeance. Later, when the fire has eaten its fill and the militia has beaten back the attackers, she finds a singed collar near the well. It smells of tar. She tucks it in a drawer and never speaks of it. But on winter nights, when frost feathers the window and the hearth's warmth is a fragile yellow coin, she strokes the collar with a thumb and thinks of her cat bolting into the dark, like a prayer someone was too afraid to say aloud. A chronicler records none of this. He writes instead of banners and oaths, of saints invoked and villains named. He tells the story of how the town held out 3 weeks against a northern earl famed for his cruelty, how the market cross was splintered by a stone, how the aldermen negotiated the surrender that allowed women and children to depart with 1 wagon apiece. He does not write about the sacks that moved in the dusk along the ditch line, or the small desperate lives pressed into the palms of men. But another hand, anonymous, perhaps a clerk with a softer heart, adds a margin note. On the 3rd night, the sky burned east to west with the speed of an arrow. One could hear the creatures cry, and I confess I prayed that God would make me deaf. A single line in the gutter of a manuscript, a flicker of conscience among flourishes of praise and condemnation, and suddenly, the official story is haunted by a shadow that will not quite leave. Knowledge travels faster than guilt. In a smoky tavern, an artilleryman from the Rhineland tells a young captain about a trick he once saw. Attach a slow match to a cat or a pigeon and release it at twilight. You need not aim the fire. Home will aim it for you. He draws a crude sketch on the table with a wine-dipped finger. A small harness, a twist of rope, a spark creeping like a worm. The captain laughs uncomfortably and orders another ale. He will not use such a tactic, he swears. Then, a month later, when the granary is full on the wrong side of the wall and his men are beginning to slip away at night in search of food, he remembers the sketch and weighs it against his honor and finds that hunger has more weight than conscience. There are manuals of war that speak the language of diagrams rather than screams. In one, an artist shows a cat with a coiling fuse fastened to its back and a bird flitting away with a contraption tied to its leg, as if war had become a pageant of fireworks. The caption is dry as dust, the ink Nita's prayer. The intention is not cruelty. At least, that is what the scribe tells himself as he copies the illustration. The intention is to win. If you can empty a town with fire, you save your soldiers from ladders and walls and boiling oil. You save your own men, even if it costs the lives of creatures who did not ask to enlist. War is an accountant that tallies numbers and looks away when asked about names. And yet, tactics have lives. They are born, they grow fat on success, and then they often fail for precisely the reasons they once worked. A commander who relied on animals learned quickly that chaos is a two-faced ally. A cat does not read a map. A pigeon cannot tell your city from theirs when panic sings in its skull. More than one army released living fire, only to watch a thatch they had meant to spare flare up like a torch, to see their own picket lines silhouette against a blaze they themselves had ignited. Panic is contagious, and in the tremor between release and impact lies the entire risk of the plan. To put your hope in an animal's instinct is to build a bridge on water and then step onto it with your whole weight. What did towns do in response? They learned fire as a language and wrote new defenses in it. Watchtowers sprouted iron bells. Wells were dug where none had been. Ladders for the fire watch leaned permanently against gables. Barrels were kept filled even in rain. Ordinances appeared, fines for thatch not well trimmed, for chimneys not kept sound, for candle lanterns left swinging in barns dry as kindling itself. Guilds of masons grew rich on contracts for tile roofs and brick chimneys, and slowly, in richer quarters, the skyline changed color, from the honey of reed to the dull red of clay. Fire became not only a military terror, but a municipal problem, and with it came the bureaucracy of prevention that would one day bear the proud title of fire brigade. A tactic meant for war-pressed cities towards safety and peace, as if cruelty had inadvertently paid for a better bucket. The cultural echoes were stranger still. Cats, already entangled in superstition. Night walkers, witch companions, creatures whose pupils widened with uncanny suddenness, suffered for the sins men wrote across their backs. Where fire had been seen at their heels, suspicion followed. In bad harvest years, towns blamed someone. Often it was women who lived alone and the animals who kept them company. Cats were tossed from towers at festivals, burned in baskets, mocked in plays that had too much fear in them to be called jokes. And then a pestilence came with the rats. And some whispered, when it was too late, that killing the cats had been a foolishness dressed as piety. War's logic had slunk into the house and lain down by the hearth, and the house had not forgiven it. The moral imagination of the age grappled with the dissonance. Preachers thundered about cruelty, then blessed armies as they marched past with carts of tar. Knights spoke of honor at dawn and suggested pigeons at dusk. Chronicles praised mercy and recorded, without comment, that a market quarter burned so fiercely one could read by its light 2 streets away. People are complicated. An apothecary who tended the burns of a boy who tried to stamp out a roof fire would, in older age, quietly buy milk for strays and set the bowl just within the shop's door so no one would see him do it. A mason who laid tiles for the new fire code would, when drunk, sing a song about a cat that brought him luck in a siege. And the song would be bawdy, because laughter is a shield we lift when we cannot lift guilt. There were other living weapons in those centuries. Beehives lobbed over walls to break like clay pots and let a storm of stings fly. Oxen driven with blazing brush tied to their horns to scatter a cavalry's charge. Even dogs trained to carry small pots of oil to gates and dash at a whistle. Each of these was a line crossed by a man who later told himself he had only shifted a line that had been shifting all his life. He would point, if asked, at the enemy's atrocities, at starving children, at duty. War is a market where excuses are sold by the bushel and bought dear. And yet, when we follow the thread to its end, what remains in the hand is not a tactic, but a story. And stories change us in ways supply lists do not. The soldier who held the sack, the widow in the lane, the clerk with the tremor in his script, the captain who nodded and could not sleep, the boy who strapped the harness and then threw it in the river. These are the small engines that turn the great gears of history. They are the fingerprints on the lever, the smudges on the page, the breath in the fog of a memory that refuses to clear. We often ask if such tactics worked, as if the only measure that counts is the banner that hung on the gate at noon. But the question of working ends too soon, because the fire does not stop at the parapet. It runs along rafters into songs and fear and law, into the way a daughter looks at a cat and thinks of witchcraft instead of play, into the way a city taxes its bricklayers, into the way a priest preaches about mercy with a tremor and cannot name why. The medieval world did not have committees of ethics in war, but it had people who ached. And that ache is a map if you know how to read it. One winter, long after the siege had passed, the soldier, the one whose name we do not know, walked the edge of a frozen pond. He had a small child on his shoulders who tugged at his cap and laughed at the cold's bite on his nose. A cat followed them at a distance, stepping in their footprints because the pressed snow was easier. The soldier turned once and saw the cat's yellow eyes and felt the lake shift under his feet. Not from ice, but from memory. He lifted the child down and pointed at the reeds where the wind hummed. "Listen," he said. The child cupped his ears and nodded solemnly, as if he too could hear the thin thread of a sound the world had not finished singing. They walked home together, and the cat kept its distance but kept coming, as cats do, as stories do when we try to send them away. When we look for consequences that last beyond the flame, we find some written in stone. Cities rebuilt in tile, and brick changed the pace of fire, slowed it until water could catch up. Watchmen learned to analyze the wind like seasoned captains, and to scatter their men not where the flames raged but where they soon would. Whole trades grew around, preventing heat from leaping roof to roof. War, which had been the teacher of this lesson, receded like a tide and left behind a better seawall. Other consequences are less proud. The ease with which people learned to use animals as tools did not unlearn itself easily. Centuries later, and continents away, schemes would resurface with new materials, old logic. That homing instinct can be weaponized, that nature's loyalties can be twisted into fuses. Each time a certain part of the mind, the part that counts numbers and not names, would nod and reach for a bucket of pitch wearing a modern label. But there is something else the story leaves that we do not always credit. It leaves a warning shaped like a mirror. We are clever. We are desperate. We live in houses that burn and academies that justify. The line between a smart trick and a moral wound is as thin as a rag dipped in oil. When we hear that some town in some century tied fire to fur and called it strategy, we are not reading a freakish exception. We are reading a possibility inside ourselves, one that requires discipline to refuse. The discipline in those days came too seldom. Today it has different names: law, convention, conscience. But it cannot flourish without memory. Memory is the water we throw on old sparks so they do not leap the centuries and land in our thatch. So picture, finally, a city not unlike those that burned. Morning after, ash drifting down like quiet snow. The walls stand, pocked and blackened. The market is a smear of charcoal. The church's bell is cracked into a tongue that will never sing again. From a half-collapsed loft, a cat steps gingerly, whiskers singed to nubs and drops to the sill. It pauses, blinks into the pale sun, and vanishes along a ledge where weeds find purchase in mortar. In the street below, people begin to move in the old rhythms. Buckets, shovels, hands. Because that is what people do when the worst is past. By noon, the outlines of stalls are sketched in new chalk. By vespers, someone will have swept a corner clean and lit a candle. That night, a tired watchman will sit on the parapet and look out over a plain the color of iron and think of cats and of fire and of orders and of silence. He will put his face in his hands and not cry because there is no time left for that. Instead, he will stand, check the wind, and make sure the barrels are full. This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about people, told with the materials at hand. rope, tar, hunger, fear, and the terrible creativity of the cornered. It is also a story about how even the smallest lives, soft-footed, sharp-eyed, ready to run at the slightest sound, can be drafted into a war they do not understand. We tell it not because we enjoy the shudder, but because the shudder is a teacher. The past has placed this ember in our palm. It is warm. It could burn again.